Welcome everyone to the first seminar for the XLs for 2024. And it's great that you all are here and joining us. It's quite a very appropriate subject matter from my perspective, given the time of year. And when I look out in my backyard, I see all of the spring flowers starting to pop. And it's quite exciting. And I'm very excited to have Lou Feldman here with us, and he graciously will walk us through the wonders of the UC Berkeley Botanical Garden and its features and its the exciting things that it's doing, that the garden is up to. And also, I think what's really unique about the garden is how much it actually provides for the community in terms of access and education and research opportunities. Welcome, Lou. And I think very briefly, Lou wears two hats these days, one being the director of the garden, and the other being still professor of biology, or I'm sorry, professor of biology in the school of in the Department of molecular biology and
plant and microbial biology.
Microbiology. There we go. So, without further ado, I'd like to ask Lou to take over from here.
First of all, I want to thank Howard, I believe, for inviting me. This is really a privilege to be able to talk to the retirees, among whom I'm probably going to number myself in the not too distant future. I've been at Berkeley for a long time, and taking over the directorship of the garden, which I've done for about 4.5 years now, was not something I had planned, but it's turning out to be a remarkable opportunity. And what I'd like to do today is to tell you a little bit about the garden. I realize many of you know quite a lot about the garden and likely have visited, but there are also some behind the scenes challenges that I'd like to let you know about, and perhaps tell you something about the role the garden plays in the community and in the university that you may not be familiar with. So we'll begin with the view of the garden from the main gate, and it is a botanical garden which is unique in the world, and I hope to impress upon you the uniqueness, and also in a way to acknowledge the university for providing some support for the garden. Now, the outline of the talk will be history of the garden, something about the collections, and our different types of activities which involve conservation, teaching, and research. And I'll move through this fairly quickly, but I hope that it'll raise some questions, or maybe it will acquaint you with some aspects of the garden that you may not be familiar with. So the garden has 3 main missions, and we'll talk about them a bit more. The most important mission, I think, is really to maintain this very diverse collection of plants in support of teaching and research at the university. We are a university institution, and we want to make sure that we serve the university. In a more general sense, we want to work on the conservation of plant diversity, and I'll talk to you about some of our conservation activities toward the end. And most, I think, importantly for the community, we really want to promote public understanding and appreciation of the natural world, in particular about plants. And I think, as you'll see as we go through the talk, this is particularly important now with all the challenges that we're facing in the environment. So one of the questions is, why have a botanical garden? And I always like to tell people that, from my point of view, that the future of humanity, and I realize this is probably a very narrow view, really depends on individuals being able to partner with nature or to partner with plants. Unless we're able to do this, we're really going to shorten the time that we exist as a species on this planet. The challenges that we face right now are mostly climate change, and the garden is a resource because it has plants collected from many portions of the world, which we'll talk about, and we're able to grow these plants and to gather life histories on them. We also maintain plants that are either rare or endangered or sometimes extinct in the natural environment. So in many ways, people have considered the garden to be somewhat like a Noah's Ark, but a Noah's Ark for plants. The garden, for those of you who are biologists, or even if you're not, the garden really represents a collection of DNA, the memory of the plants, and the memory of the plants from their natural habitats. And this is a very important aspect of this garden, which I'm going to go back to, is that most of the plants which we have in this garden, and from the previous slide you saw there were somewhere of 20,000, most of the plants are collected from the wild. And this is particularly important for research and also for the survival of these plants, because we have the original DNA of plants which have been growing for many millennia in particular habitats. And so they have in their background many different types of genes which hopefully will allow them to adapt as climate changes. These are not hybrids. These are not the plants you would buy, for example, at Home Depot, which have many of the important genes for survival bred out or silenced. These are plants which have their original genetic material. And this is a very important role that the garden has in maintaining these plants. Now, the garden was actually one of the first sort of collective units formed on the campus in 1890. And for those of you who were around then, and I know there aren't any of you, the garden actually began on the main campus at Berkeley. And if you know the main campus, what we're doing here from this view is we're standing on the steps of the library, looking toward the north, across the grassy area toward the East Asian Library. The East Asian Library occupies the space that the garden formerly occupied when it was on the campus. The garden remained on the campus until the mid-1920s, and then as the campus began to grow, it needed the space that the garden had. However, prior to actually moving to Strawberry Canyon, where we're now located, that I'll tell you about, the garden occupied not only this land that now is where the East Asian Library is, but land all the way up to the steps of the library. Now, in place of the East Asian Library, or preceding it, was a greenhouse. And the greenhouse on the bottom would occupy the land that the East Asian Library now occupies. And it is no longer in existence, but for those of you who've been to Golden Gate Park, to the conservatory, it is a smaller version of the Conservatory of Flowers in San Francisco. This building was torn down when the garden was forced to move. And the garden had to move from the main campus as a result of the campus enlarging and needing the land that was occupied by the garden. This is an interesting picture because it actually shows, we're looking at the north-facing area of the library, and you can see that the garden extended up practically to the steps of the north-facing portion of the library. It was quite extensive, and this land became very valuable. And so in the 1920s, this is 1924, the campus began a move to Strawberry Canyon for the Botanical Garden. However, for those of you who still wander the campus, behind the undergraduate library, behind Moffett Library, and between Moffett Library and the East Asian Library, there are still a few plants that are left over from the original Botanical Garden. They are still growing on the median, and they are plants which have been around probably since the early 1900s. When the garden moved up, and it moved up in the late 1920s to Strawberry Canyon, this land that it now occupies, where we are today, was basically a dairy farm. And we still have some remnants of the dairy farm, including the original barn, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. And the land was, as you can see here, fairly open. Many people have asked me, and I don't really know what the correct answer is, what was the habitat of the land before the European settlers came and presumably cleared the land? What did the Native Americans see? And I'm not quite sure that I know what the correct answer is, but this is the view of the garden property, probably in the early 1900s. Here we have a view looking toward downtown Berkeley in the land that the garden would have occupied. And you can see it's kind of open grassland, and the buildings you see down in front are part of the original dairy farm. The land, here you can see there was a landslide, but I put this picture in because it shows something about what the land was like. It was fairly open. There were a few scattered trees, but most of it had been heavily grazed. In the 1930s, shortly after the garden moved up here, the WPA established a work camp up here. and you can see where the football stadium is looking toward the west, toward where the Golden Gate Bridge would be. The WPA actually made a lot of the paths in the garden, and a lot of the step paths are due to their activities. This was a way of actually having the garden grow, and there was a WPA camp located where the garden is now. In 1928, when the WPA people worked, you can see that there are some paths which were outlined in the garden. For those of you who have been to the garden before, the one grassy area we have is shown on the top upper right, and it was developed from a sort of a meadow from paths that were put in by the WPA workers. Now, if we look across the lawn, this gives you an idea of what the garden looked like shortly after it had moved up from the main campus. There are small trees which have been planted. The lawn is pictured over here to the left, and here on the lawn you can see where eventually there will be activities that we're going to talk about. But notice that the hills are fairly clear. The garden is occupying only apparently a small space, eventually though to occupy 34 acres of land. Now, since 1996, the garden is administered by the Vice Chancellor of Research here on the campus, and it's part of the Campus Natural History Museum Consortium. Some of you may know this. The natural history museums on the campus are quite extensive. They consist of the Entomology Museum, Vertebrate Zoology, the Hearst Anthropology, Paleontology Museum, the Jepson Herbarium, University in Jepson Herbarium, which have a very close association with the garden, and the Botanical Garden. Of these museums, only the Hearst Museum, besides us, has any public outreach. All of the rest of them are closed to the public, and in many ways the garden is a big window into the university, and we serve a very important interface between the public and the university. And I want to point this out, even though we're part of the museum complex, we're really a different museum. And in another way we're very different is that all of these other museums have dead organisms. We're the only one with living organisms. And as a result, this brings special problems. Like a zoo, you have to feed your animals, we have to care for the plants, plants die, and they have to be replaced. These other museums have dead material and don't have to come or meet those challenges that we have. Now, what the garden is not. The garden is not a display garden, as you might find when you went to, for example, Filoli. And there's nothing wrong with a display garden, but display gardens tend to have plants which are of only a few types, but many of that one type is planted. And most of these plants tend to be hybrids, again, with the original DNA either bred out or with it silenced. The garden, rather here, is a specimen garden. And in a specimen garden, we have plants from all continents except Antarctica, from 9 geographical regions, which I'll talk about. We have some very special collections, which we'll mention, and we have a large number of plants wild collected, almost 13,000 plants. And of those 13,000, when they're added to the garden collection, they're called accessions. So we have greater than 20,000 accessions. And this goes back to the point that I made, that we are a potential Noah's Ark, in this case, a plant ark. Now, it's really, what I'm always amazed about is that this garden is a university garden, but the gardens to which the university compares us are gardens which are very well known in the world. We're one of the top, most diverse collections in the US. As I said, most of our plants are wild collected, which distinguishes us from practically every garden in the world. We are rated among the top gardens in the world, and we have more plants growing outdoors than many other gardens. And I'll touch this on this topic later on. And in part, it's because of the weather and the microclimates which we have here in the Botanical Garden. In comparing us to other gardens, and I want you to see this comparison here, the UC Botanical Garden is toward the bottom, but notice the gardens to which it's compared are either municipal gardens or are private gardens which have tremendous support. This garden fares extremely well compared to these other gardens, all of which are very highly supported by either municipalities or federal agencies, and we have to work in a very different way. What I want to point out to you is that the number of endangered species which we have here in the garden is quite high. Only the Missouri Botanical Garden has more than we have, and this is an important role that we serve. And this figure is low. The provenance means wild collected. knowing where they come from, this figure is now up towards 80%. So we really have, compared to these other gardens, which have material that is, there's nothing or little known about where that was collected from, whether it's the original material or not. We have a tremendous resource here, which is heavily used by researchers. Now, when you come to the garden, as I know many of you have, we try to name the plants, although I know it's extremely frustrating to find a plant that's in flower and can't find the sign, or find the sign broken. We have a lot of animals that enjoy eating the plasticizer of the sign, and so we are constantly replacing them. When you look at the sign, there'll be some information on the Latin name, the taxonomic family it's found, but probably the most interesting thing is this number up here in the upper right-hand corner. The first part of the number tells you the year the plant was brought into the botanical garden. So this one was brought in 1950. And that year, it was the 1178th plant that was brought into the garden. This number, for those of you who want more information, takes you on our website to a database which is freely available to the public and provides you with a wealth of information about this plant, the soils that it was growing in, the other plants that it was with, the altitude, many pieces of information that researchers would want to know about. And you might, as gardeners, be interested in learning about if you would like to see whether this plant would grow in your garden. The database also allows you to do queries, and again, this is freely available to the public. Once you go onto our website under the Collections pull-down tab, you can search for plants by typing in. You can see the various ways you can search for them, and this will bring up information on the plants in the collection that you might have an interest in, or you may want to find out more information, or you may want to find out when it's flowering. You may want to be interested in getting a picture of it. We live in a Mediterranean climate, and a Mediterranean climate is a rare climate. Only about 2% of the Earth's land surface is a Mediterranean like we have here. It's coastal. We have, as many of you know, warm summers, which are usually drought, and mild winters with rain, as we're having now. And as a result of this mild climate, as I mentioned before, we can grow a vast variety of plants. The Mediterranean climate, of course, is named for the region around the Mediterranean Sea, and all of these countries here which touch on it are Mediterranean. California is at the same latitude as European Mediterranean climate, so most of the plants which grow here can be grown in California. But what I want to point out to you is that an equal distance below the equator, as we are above, is a Mediterranean climate, and that would be in Australia, South Africa, and Central America, Chile and Argentina. And as a result of these areas having Mediterranean climates, our garden here at Berkeley has very strong collections from these particular Mediterranean climates. And if you come here, you will see the collections, as we'll talk about, from these various areas. And I will refer back to this collection in South Africa shortly. The garden is also extremely well known because it has what are known as nationally accredited collections. These are collections which are used heavily by researchers, where we have a lot of, or many of the species in a particular genus of plants. We have 4 nationally recognized collections: the oaks, and you can see over here the variety of oaks that we have, and magnolias. Some of the magnolias are flowering now. If you want to come to the garden and see some really spectacular plants, the magnolias would certainly be worthwhile. We have 34 different species, perhaps a larger number now, of magnolias. We have a large collection of ferns, almost 400 different species of ferns. And these are one of the best collections in the world of ferns located in one place. And what I want to point out to you is that we have a large collection of ferns which grow in very dry environments like Mexico and Arizona. These are going to be the plants which we need to think about using as the climate changes and as it becomes hotter. And finally, we have a nationally accredited collection of plants, which I'm going to refer back to, but I want to just introduce to you now, known as cycads. These are plants which evolved before the dinosaurs and were part of the dinosaur menu. And I want to talk to you about them shortly, but they are also part of the reason why this garden is so widely recognized. The other aspect of the garden, aside from having wild collected plants, is that the garden groups the plants not by how they're related to each other, but by their location geographically. And if this is a sort of a satellite view of the garden, you can see the various areas of the garden and some of the main pathways. Although I have said to you that most of the plants in the garden, 80%, are wild collected, we do have a few gardens, which I'll touch on, which are not wild collected plants, but which people value. One of those is the Garden of Old Roses, which we'll touch upon. And it consists of roses which are cultivated, but are cultivated from many, many older stocks from some time ago. The garden's largest collection, and here's a map of what we showed before, is California. And in California, we have about 30% of all the different species which grow in California. And we have a large number of endangered species, which I'll talk to you about. The California area consists of two parts, with a part over here, which is the main part of the garden. Across the street, where the parking lot is located, is the Redwood Grove, which is a remarkable, a very enriching atmosphere to go into, and I'll touch on that shortly. The other aspect of California, which is really important, is for many of you, California consists of very many different habitats. And that's what makes this place a very unusual place to live, because of these many habitats which allow for a wide variety of plants. In the garden, for educational purposes, we try to duplicate many of these special habitats so that the students, and many classes come up, can use these habitats to see what plants grow in them and what they look like. These are some of the habitats that you will find here in the garden, which we construct to mimic what's found throughout California. And these are a few of them, and I'm going to show you some pictures of several of them now. One of the habitats that California has is serpentine. Serpentine soils are soils which have various types of heavy metals. The metals are such a high concentration that most plants will not grow on them, although some plants will grow on them. They're serpentine plants. And these plants are able to grow not terribly well, but they don't have much competition. And we have a large area of the garden meant to duplicate the serpentine environment. California has high altitude mountains, and in the high altitudes, we have an alpine area where the plants are quite prostrate, low on the ground. They have a limited time of flowering, and they have mechanisms to keep themselves from drying out and from avoiding the cold. And this is illustrated in the alpine field area of the garden. For those of you who drive up to Sacramento, shortly before you get to Davis, if you're on Highway 80, and you look out to the right, it's known as the Jepson Plain. And the Jepson Plain consists of depressions in the soil, which fill with water. And then as the water evaporates, what we find is that the plants around the periphery of the water begin to flower. This is a very unique environment in California. And this is the type of flowering that you get. It's almost a bullseye pattern. As the water evaporates, different flowers come out. And we duplicate a vernal pool environment by actually digging a hole in the ground, filling it with water, and then planting the seeds along the periphery of the water. And as the water evaporates, we find that we can duplicate the vernal pool environment that you'd find in the Jepson Plain. And this is used by students, not only Berkeley students, but we have a large number who come from community colleges and from other portions of California to see these vernal pools. For those of you who've been up to the north coast of California, there's an area known as the Pygmy Forest. The Pygmy Forest is unique because the layer of soil is very thin, and underneath that layer of soil is a hard pan, so that the roots of the plants growing there cannot develop very extensively, and the plants become dwarfed. And we duplicate that environment here in the garden by putting down a layer of concrete, and then on that layer of concrete, a very thin layer of soil, and the plants remain dwarfed, the Pygmy Forest. The other area which I want to begin to tell you about is the other Mediterranean area. So California has some very different types of habitats. The other areas, we don't try to make the habitats as distinctive as they would be found in the native environment, but we rather try to get a representation of plants from those areas. And probably the most spectacular area in the garden, and I want to say that this area is going to be coming into bloom at the end of March, and I'd like to encourage you all to come up and see it. It's quite a remarkable experience, is South Africa. The garden has probably the largest collection, a variety at least, of South African plants outside of South Africa, which are just about coming into flower. And so I want to tell you that this is a wonderful time if you're able to come up and see it. Notice that the garden has across from South Africa these other geographic areas, and each of those will have a particular time which is getting ready to flower. For example, in the Asia area now, for those of you who are rhododendron africandos, the rhododendrons are just starting to come out. This is where you'd find many of the magnolias. Here is South Africa. This is not in its peak bloom, but it's a wonderful area where there are a variety of South African plants, and you can see the labels here if you're interested in the plants, and many of them are labeled. Across the road from South Africa is the deserts of the Americas, and we have a remarkable collection of cacti, which can be grown outdoors because of our climate, and it is a wonderful place to wander through, and there are always cacti flowering. We have many rare cacti here, and every weekend we have people who, for some reason, want to touch the cactus and get little prickles in their fingers, and so we keep a roll of Scotch tape in the office, which is one way of getting some assistance for them. The rhododendrons, which I mentioned to you before, they represent the area of the garden that was first planted when it moved up from the main campus, and the rhododendrons are coming out. There's a Japanese pool here. Many people are in love with the Japanese pool because of the newts, which are salamander-like organisms, 2 different species of newts, and they are in the process of laying a tremendous number of egg cases. You can actually see them, and we recently did the pool. We had to take it out, everything out, because it was leaking, and now we are replanting it with wild collected plants from China, and the newts are extremely happy, as you can see. So I want to encourage you, especially if you have grandkids or children who are really interested, the newts are a high point of attraction. It's a wonderful place to visit in the fall. The rocks which surround the pool and the Japanese lanterns which surround it came from the Japanese pavilion in the World's Fair, the 1939 World's Fair in San Francisco, and was brought over here. And I've been told that everything was installed only a couple of days before Pearl Harbor. Had that not been installed, we would never have gotten these particular items. We also have a very interesting garden of plants which are not wild collected. It's a Chinese medicinal herb garden. Many of you may know in San Francisco there are several schools of traditional Chinese medicine, and they asked us if they gave us a grant, would we plant some of the plants so that their students who normally see only the dead material could see what the plants look like when they were alive. And so we have a very popular garden of Chinese medicinal plants, and the plants are in the garden and they are indicated by what diseases they treat. And for those of you who may speak Chinese, the characters will tell you perhaps more about traditional native uses of the plants. So it's a very popular garden and it's very well maintained. Another garden which doesn't consist of wild collected plants is a culinary herb garden, and these are many of the plants that you use in cooking. We encourage you to squeeze the leaves, smell them. Many of these different herbs or spices are available as potted plants in the place where we sell them. The Old Rose Garden, which I mentioned to you before, is a wonderful place to visit or when the roses peak, probably in late April, early May. Mother's Day is usually a good time, and get a great view of the bay on a clear day. Across the street, as I said, is the Redwood Grove. The Redwood Grove is part of the California area. It consists of trees that were only planted about 1930, but they look like they're much older, and they're nearly 500 trees. The Redwood Grove is named after Mather, who was the individual who was founded the Park Service. Many of the sort of background rules for the Park Service, the ideas, were crafted here at Berkeley, and the Redwood Grove is named after Mather. We have in the Redwood Grove, as many of you may be aware, an amphitheater, and the amphitheater is it's a spiritual place to visit, really. And we have many different types of activities there, including concerts. We even have weddings, and there have been bar mitzvahs there. It's a great place for being out in nature and being able to experience something very different than if you were indoors. And now I just want to return to this idea of the garden being an arc and tell you something what we do, and also return to those plants which were called cycads that I mentioned to you before. We have a large collection of cycads. How did we get this collection? These are plants which are mainly from South Africa and Australia. How did we get them? Well, the cycads are in many cases considered to be very, very rare plants, very endangered plants. In some cases, except for collections, they're extinct. And so how could we get plants which are rare and endangered in the garden? And the way we got them is that there was a sting operation. These plants are so rare and endangered that, like ivory, they're not allowed to be imported into the US. About 15 years ago, however, there was a sting operation. About 1,000 of these plants were being brought in illegally. And basically, what we have in this picture here are the trunks of the plants. The leaves have been cut off. And these plants were confiscated by the federal government, who asked the garden, our botanical garden, to hold the plants while the trial was going on. And the trial went on. The people were convicted. And then about 200 of the plants had died, but about 800 were still alive, and they were given to the garden. So we suddenly had a very rich collection of these very rare and very unusual plants. Some of these plants were so rare and so endangered in their natural environments, which were mostly South Africa, and they were so valuable that the original owners had microchipped them. And so it was possible for us to return a few of these plants to their original owners based upon the information in the microchips. But most of them weren't. Most of them were unknown as far as their previous ownership. So we now have a large collection of these plants, many of which are growing outdoors, but also we have some, because they are accustomed to a little warmer weather, that we've sent down to Huntington Botanical Garden in Southern California. Collectors know that we have these rare plants. We've been told that some of them would cost upwards of $50,000 if a collector tried to buy them. And so we have to keep these rare cycads in a double barbed wire chain link fenced area, which I'd be glad to show any of you. It's not an area open to the public. And it's called the cycad jail, where we keep these plants so that we hopefully will not be able to have them stolen. Lastly, I just want to, before we end, talk to you about some of the other activities. We've talked about our sort of keeping plants alive and growing them. The garden also has a role in conservation. And we receive a number of grants and requests from these different agencies, among those who ask us to work on conservation activities for them, and in particular for rare and endangered California species. And these are some of the plants which are rare and endangered in California that have been worked on as a result of grants which we received from these agencies. Many of these plants grow in areas that were grazed or were heavily developed as far as housing is concerned, and they have been eliminated. And in particular, on the slopes of Mount Diablo and Mount Tamalpais, heavy grazing went on, and a lot of these plants were known historically to be in these areas, but have since been eliminated. So the garden has been asked to reintroduce some of them to those areas that we knew they formerly grew in. Sometimes, however, a plant has been listed as extinct. And this is a plant on the slopes of Mount Diablo, which was last recorded, I think, in the 1920s. It's a buckwheat plant. And it was thought to be extinct. And then this graduate student in the lower left-hand corner here was out on Mount Diablo one day hiking, and he came across one of these plants. He let the garden know about it, and the garden went and collected seed of this particular plant, and then grew up this plant and got a grant from the federal government. And the plants then were many, many times multiplied and then replanted out on the slopes of Mount Diablo. So this is an example of repopulating a region where these plants grew, but were essentially for almost 100 years no longer found. Another one of the plants which comes from only one locality in Marin is this delphinium, a beautiful plant, which also, except for this one locality, was listed as extinct. The garden grew this plant. It's having trouble getting reestablished, but this is the type of work the garden does in conservation. One of our most successful reintroductions to conservation is called the large flowered Amsinkia fiddleneck fern, fiddleneck flower, and this particular plant has been reintroduced into its native environment and is prospering. There are tens of thousands of these plants. We're really glad to see this growing well. And we have a lot of students who help us reintroduce the plants back onto the slopes. This is of the Amsinkia, the large flower fiddleneck plant that I referred to before. And in this particular area, the plants are just prospering in the main because of last year's rain and hopefully because of this year's rain as well. The garden has a large role in education. Aside from the students from the various classes here on campus, and there are a large number of classes which come up here. As I said, there are community colleges which come here, and a large number of the Berkeley school system and Oakland school system students are brought to the garden. Here is an example of the kind of educational activities we're involved with. We have a large grove of papyrus plants, And one of the issues on the campus is that, as some of you may know, there were at one time a large number of papyrus scrolls housed in the campanile. They were called the Teptunis papyrus scrolls. And a papyrologist was hired to translate the scrolls in the 80s. And this individual also wanted to give a class to students on papyrus, and he wanted to show them how to make papyrus paper. So he asked us to plant papyrus, and although that class is no longer given, we received many requests, recently just this year, requests from one of the theology schools in North Berkeley for papyrus to show the students how papyrus paper is made. So the garden has a number of roles in many classes on campus. For those of you who are brave, this particular class in integrated biology studies the environment at the top of the tall trees, what organisms are found growing on the leaves, and the students presumably have to climb up to the top of the redwood trees to see what's there. We have an architecture, landscape architecture class. They are interested in projects. They built this bridge that you can see here in the lower left-hand corner. So we really try to involve many different students, many different classes here in the garden. Garden also has a large number of activities as far as outreach. We really do, as a public-facing institution, interact with a large number of the public. We have concerts, as I mentioned, in the Redwood Grove and other types of activities. How do we increase the collections in the garden? Well, in past days, you could send a truck out and around the world, and you would be able to collect plants. But for many reasons, including that it's dangerous and also that many countries were taken advantage of, we no longer can send a truck out to collect plants ourselves. And so we depend upon exchanges with colleagues in other countries. And right now we are beginning an exchange with people in Chile. As many of you know, there was a fire in Chile recently which destroyed their main botanical garden. And as it turns out, we had already started our activities of collecting Chilean plants, of which we have a large collection before that fire. And I do want to mention to you that some of the Chilean plants were destroyed. We have plants that were collected in the 1950s from Chile, and they're asking us now, because they know these are wild collected plants, for offshoots, for cuttings of these plants, so that they can use to repopulate some of the areas that were destroyed by fire. Today, the only collecting we can do is mostly in the US and mostly in California, in part because of the many restrictions. And so we have a large amount of collecting done in California, but even with that, many, many permits are needed. Just for some of you who are interested in some of the unusual changes, probably the most recent one is the movement of building, which was designed by Julia Morgan to the garden. It used to occupy a footprint where the business school wanted to expand into, but they couldn't tear it down. So they paid for the movement of this building to the garden. And it looks like it's been here since the beginning of the garden. It fits perfectly. How about running a garden? Well, as you might guess, most of the budget for the garden is taken up with salaries and benefits, and a relatively small percent are taken up with supplies and expenses. And you can see the number of employees. There are about 30 employees. We have a lot of work study students who come up here, and they really assist us. How do we make our living? How do we get our revenue? We get some money from the campus, but not very much, about 15%. Most of our income comes from these various programs, which I show you over here. For those of you who haven't visited the gift shop, I've been told it's one of the nicest gift shops in the Bay Area, something you want to perhaps have a look at. And there are many other activities, including admissions, that you see listed here for generating our funds. Some of our big projects, we're renovating our greenhouses. We have to irrigate the plants, so we're trying to update the system. As I mentioned, we want to expand the collection. We are really interested in expanding our outreach programs. Again, in order to get people to partner with nature, we have to go and meet them. And finally, one of our big revenue sources is our membership. And because of that, and because I was giving this talk, our membership director asked me to make this offer to the group. And I know many of you are already members of the garden. And this offer is, if you want to join, you get a 20% discount off your membership purchase. And all you need to do is to go to the webpage and type in Garden 20 February, which will be the promotional discount rate. That's something that we would hope that you would be interested in doing. As I said, the income and the support of this garden comes from ways that we have to generate. So with that, I'm going to stop and just tell you that I think the campus has a remarkable resource here, and many of you probably who live in the Bay Area probably don't appreciate what we have here. I hope that I've given you a taste of something and perhaps inspired some of you to visit who haven't been here before. But I'm always struck when we have visitors, how many are international and how many tell us. We have a logbook at the exit of the garden, the comments that the people make, how for them, especially those who visited many botanical gardens, this one stands out. So thank you very much. And I will be joining you probably eventually in about 1.5 years when I retire. So I'm looking forward to it. Thank you.